But that does get us right to 8:30, so I can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, my name is Elizabeth, and as you have probably guessed after this past little bit, I'm going to be the one presenting this program tonight. Now, because due to this heat, it is still about that 93 heat index, so we are going to have to modify the program a little bit. We are going to shorten it to about 30-35 minutes or so. But in that 30-35 minutes, we are going to pack a lot into here. Now, as we were kind of discussing, we were given kind of free reign to talk about these topics and kind of pick and choose what we want to do, as long as it pertains to the Civil War, and if it has a Gettysburg connection, even better. And so I decided that it's time to return to a park I used to work at, Fort Pulaski, located down in Savannah, Georgia. Spent 3 years of my life there, and it is a fascinating little park. And it has some surprising Gettysburg connections that not often many people kind of realize. So hopefully those will be a nice little surprise for folks who perhaps are expecting to not really talk about Gettysburg tonight. But to get started, the most important question that folks are probably wondering is, where on earth is Fort Pulaski? I've never heard of it before. Or perhaps some of you may have visited it. If you've ever been down to Savannah, Georgia, Fort Pulaski is located about 15 miles from Savannah itself, all the way down near Tybee Island. If you look on my map here, that was lovely, taken from Google Maps, you'll see right downtown Forsyth Park, that marks downtown Savannah. Over here where it says Captain Mike's Dolphin Tour, that'll be Tybee Island. And right there in the middle of that river is Fort Pulaski National Monument. Fort Pulaski National Monument is going to be sitting on a little tiny island called Campfire Island. But why is this fort located in the middle of the Savannah River? Today it seems to us a little bit of an odd location, but when you start to really dig into it, it starts to make a little bit more of a sense. So we'll skip over here to the construction. As you can see from this photograph, you can notice that large container ship in the river right behind it. The Savannah River has been dredged, and so you can get some massive cargo ships down that river. In fact, Savannah at the time, as of a few years ago, was still the third largest port in the United States, meaning that almost everything is probably going through Savannah at one point or another. And that's modern day. Back in the mid 1700s, even into the early 1800s, Savannah was very quickly growing as a large port city as well. And so the protection of this port city became very, very important to the United States government, especially after the War of 1812. Because in the War of 1812, the kind of coastal fortifications and their weaknesses were really revealed when the British marched right into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House to the ground. Everyone began to look around and went, that's not a good thing. We want to make sure that we are not going to be having any of our port cities or capitals burned. And so they decided to begin setting out to build a series of coastal fortifications. For Savannah, Georgia, they're going to kind of look down there, realize it's a large port city, and they're going to start looking around, trying to find the best location to build this port city. And in 1825, they choose Campfire Island because of its location. The Savannah River actually splits around Campfire Island. It's going to go into the North Channel, which you can see on that photograph, and the South Channel on the other side. Meaning, if you have to go to the Port of Savannah, you have to pass by this island. And everyone had realized that early on as well. Early in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there had actually been 2 forts previously built on Campfire Island, neither of which lasted longer than 5 to 10 years. Both nature and just disuse are going to take care of them. But for this fort, they know that they're going to build it a little bit grander than it has been in the past. So they pick the site in 1825, decide that this is the perfect island, and then in 1829, they're actually going to begin the work building what will eventually become known as Fort Pulaski. And this work is going to take a while to construct. Fort Pulaski is massive, and we'll see some photos throughout here that will kind of give you a little bit of a scale, but you can kind of start to see it. You can see in that photograph the parking lot and how tiny those cars are. So in 1829, they are going to begin this work, and it is going to be a major, major project. They are going to be bringing people in. In fact, they're going to be bringing in some names that you might recognize. Anyone ever heard of Robert E. Lee? Robert E. Lee had just recently graduated from West Point, and he was one of the top of his class. And so when he has graduated, his very first assignment out of the classroom is going to be at Fort Pulaski. He will arrive in 1829, and by 1831, he is begged to leave. That becomes kind of a common thing. Folks don't really like working at Fort Pulaski because It's hot and humid. Imagine that. You also see a lot of mosquitoes, meaning it's going to be very, very difficult for many folks to be working out here. So he will work there from 1829 to 1831, but he's never actually going to see the fort being built. Instead, he is going to be in charge of what is called the dike system, which is basically a bunch of different canals and kind of dirt that's being tossed up in order to prevent the Savannah River from flooding over into where the fort will be built. Because one thing you need to know about that river, it rises a lot, to the point that if you go there today, you will still see sometimes that the main road between Savannah and Tybee Island will be closed because of the tides that come over atop of it. But that dike system still helps that park out today. You will very rarely see it flooding all the way in unless there's a large event like a hurricane. So he arrives in 1829, begins that work, and he will be gone for fairly early on. By 1833, after Robert E. Lee has left, the fort will receive its name. It's going to be named Fort Pulaski. Now everyone usually looks at me and goes, why on earth is it named Pulaski? There's no one at that time named Pulaski, but it dates back a little bit further beyond into the history of the American Revolution. See, in October of 1779, there was a large battle that took place in Savannah. Savannah fell to the British in that fight, and one of the colonists who was going to be killed is a man named Casimir Pulaski, and that is an anglicized version of a Polish name. Casimir Pulaski had come over from Poland, and he earned the nickname the Father of American Cavalry for the Legion of Cavalry that he is going to raise. And he'll be killed in fighting there in Savannah. And so as they're looking around, beginning to name all of these forts that they are building, they look at here in Savannah and go, Pulaski died here. It makes sense. Let's name this place Fort Pulaski, even though he probably never even saw that island or set foot on it. So by 1833, we get that name, Fort Pulaski, and there is still a long time left to go. We've begun the work in 1829. Robert E. Lee is gone by 1831, and in a brief overlap, you will see a man who is going to be there for 14 years. A man by the name of Joseph Mansfield. Now, Civil War historians here might recognize that name. By the time of the Civil War, Joseph Mansfield is going to join up with the Union Army. He's obviously been in an Army career before this. He's going to join up, and at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, he will be killed in the cornfield. He's going to be killed at Antietam, but he spends 14 years of his life building Fort Pulaski. By 1847, the work will be officially completed after 18 years. In the same time that it takes to raise a child, they managed to build a fort. But as I said, it is a massive fortification. You have a lot of work that's going to have to go into there, and the number one thing they're constructing this fort of is bricks. Lots and lots and lots of bricks. About 13 to 15 million bricks, to be exact. It's a lot. And I guarantee you, if you go there today, you will be overwhelmed at the number of bricks. But you'll also notice some things as you're there. If you look at this photograph, you might be able to notice that the bottom bricks are a lighter shade, whereas the bricks on top are more red in color. They're more of what we expect a brick to look like. It's because there are actually two different types of bricks used in the construction of Fort Pulaski, and this is very important. Now they're trying to save money, because this is a massive structure, and they are building other forts at the exact same time, and so the federal government's trying to make their money last. And so they're going to look around, and they're actually going to contract a local plantation called the Hermitage Plantation, about 3 miles outside of Savannah itself, to construct bricks in order to make for this fort. Those will be the small, grayer bricks that you see at the bottom. They're made out of Savannah soil, which is very sandy, meaning that they are good bricks. And if you go to Savannah, Georgia today, you will see a lot of the houses, a lot of the homes in downtown Savannah are still made out of those bricks. But there is one weakness to them. Because they're made out of that kind of softer soil, they do not hold up well under the pressure of an arch. And arches are of vital importance for Fort Pulaski. Because as we see these photographs, you're going to see that they create what are called casemates. And those casemates are going to have a little bit of a curve figure, that archway, to give them stability, to give them a little bit of strength and power. You use Savannah grays, as they are called, they're not going to hold up very well. So they knew if we're going to make these archways, we need to go and find a little bit stronger of a brick. So they're going to begin to import these red bricks from Baltimore, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia. Which means that those bricks have to be made up in this area right here, shipped down by sea to land at Fort Pulaski. Which means that if you're going to be shipping things, you need to build docks. You need to build a pier. And so before they can ever begin setting foot on building this fort, they're having to build an entire construction village. They're having to build kind of the support network around in order to build this fort. But there's one other very important thing with these bricks that I think needs to be mentioned, and that is who is making them. Because oftentimes when we kind of see these bricks, we marvel, 13, 15 million, it's so many. But the who is making them is a story that's oftentimes forgotten. In fact, for many years, it was one that was completely ignored, because the majority of these bricks are going to be made by enslaved labor, especially the Savannah grays made on the Hermitage plantation. This middle picture here shows a post-war photograph of a family that had been enslaved on that plantation, a family who very likely made some of these bricks. The Hermitage plantation was not just a brick-making plantation, it also consisted of a sawmill, an iron factory, and of course that brick plant. So there's a large amount of these folks, men, women, and children. And the making of these bricks is a very tactile experience. It's very hands-on. And so throughout the construction, you will oftentimes find bricks similar to this one over here. It may be hard to tell from the photograph, but you notice those little indentures. Those are fingerprints. Fingerprints of men, women, and children who physically had to take those bricks and turn them over as they're cooling in the sun, as they are hardening in the sun. They're waiting to be put into that kiln. We don't have names, but we know that these people are here because they quite literally left their fingerprints on this fort. If you go down there today, you can go and you can ask them. They'll be able to point these fingerprints out to you. And I think that they're a very important story. And the labor that's going into building this fort is also important. I kept mentioning Robert E. Lee and Joseph Mansfield. At certain points throughout this time, they are the ones overseeing the structure of the fort, but they're not out there physically laying these bricks. The majority of that work is going to be done by folks who are brought in, whether that be immigrants who are being hired, whether it be soldiers and engineers who are being brought in, but predominantly enslaved labor who is being brought in, hired or rented out from local plantations, and put to work building those 13, 15 million bricks in that fort. This also means that a lot of these folks have an opportunity that they didn't necessarily have. The final picture that I have up there shows a $30 reward because of someone who ran away, of an enslaved man who saw an opportunity to take his own freedom. That particular notice goes out for months. We don't know if that man is ever caught. We don't really know what happens to Harry, Jacob, or Sandy. But some of us like to believe that perhaps they got away because they're never mentioned in the papers again. You would think that they would have been. And so not only as this fort is being built, is it being built by enslaved labor, but it's also providing some of these folks an opportunity to find their freedom. In time before, long before the Civil War has come to end slavery. In 1847, the fort is finally complete. That construction village will be removed. All of those men are going to be returned back to the plantations. If they were free, they're going to be sent back to wherever they might be going next. In 1847, the fort is complete, and you might be thinking, awesome, now we can arm it, put all 146 cannons into that fort, and prepare for whatever might be coming next. Except there's a problem. It's 1847. There's no fighting going on. All the fighting's going on out west. You're going to see the Mexican-American War far away from Savannah, Georgia. And so from about 1847 to 1860, this brand new, finally completed fort is basically abandoned. They are going to put some guns in there, about 20 of them. And then they put 2 men inside that fort to take care of it for the next 14 years. They'll be luckily kind of traded out fairly often because this can be quite monotonous. And you can see in this photograph just how large of a place Fort Pulaski is. That parade ground right in the middle is about a mile all the way around. It is a massive structure built to house 146 cannons. By 1860, there's just 20 guns and 2 men there. But throughout the country in 1860, you are seeing tensions very much beginning to rise. Even as this fort is slowly falling into disrepair, because let's be real, 2 guys over 14 years are not going to be able to keep this place up by themselves. Even as this fort is falling into disrepair, the country itself is reaching a breaking point. And that breaking point is really going to come in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln is elected president, folks are not thrilled. And on December 20th of 1860, South Carolina formally secedes from the Union, becoming the very first state to do so. And that makes everyone very concerned, but no one is more concerned than Georgia, especially Savannah. Because if you were standing at Fort Pulaski and you looked off to the left across the North Channel, the ground you were looking at is South Carolina. South Carolina is literally across the river. What happens over there is going to affect Georgia one way or the other. And so Georgia, especially Savannah, is paying very close attention to what is happening. And they're especially paying attention to the fort you can see pictured on the screen now. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, another third system fortification just like Fort Pulaski. Another fort that is suddenly being occupied by United States troops. United States troops enter Fort Pulaski on December 26th, the day after Christmas. And all throughout Savannah, people are terrified because they have a fort right at the end of the river. 20 miles or so up that river sits a fort very similar to Fort Sumter. And if federal troops get inside of there and they decide that they're going to join South Carolina in secession, well, now their river is completely blockaded. You go past Fort Pulaski, you have to, or if you go past those rivers, you have to go past the fort, meaning that that fort gets guns, and that fort has enemy soldiers who are not friendly to you, you can be blockaded. And so Savannah begins to get very worried throughout the end of December, and then in January of 1861, on January 3rd, just a few days after the new year, around 200 Georgia militiamen, mostly from Savannah, are going to board a steamship, begin traveling down that river, and land at Fort Pulaski. They're going to march right up to those doors, right up to the drawbridge. They're going to knock on the door. Those two gentlemen are going to come out and immediately start handing them the keys and explaining what they go to. Because it's 2 men versus 200. It's not going to be very good odds. And so Fort Pulaski on January 3rd is going to be turned over to Georgia militiamen. 2 weeks later, on January 19th, Georgia will secede from the Union, becoming the 5th state to do so. 2 weeks after they have taken control of Fort Pulaski. It's very important. Now, when they do eventually secede from the Union, they are going to hand over this new fort to the Confederacy. Those 200 militiamen will oftentimes remain there, but they will officially become Confederate soldiers, entering into the new Confederate States of America as the war really begins to take off just up the river on April 12th, 1861. That Fort Sumter that they were all so concerned about. And the opening shots of the American Civil War fired, and eventually Fort Sumter is forced to surrender. And so for those folks waiting there in Fort Pulaski, they are feeling fairly confident. I mean, at this point, they have been able to take this fort and they've started to put it back to rights. They've begun to repair it up, begun to fix it. They've started to bring in more cannons as well. Because they know, especially with those opening shots, that a war and a battle might be coming towards them at any point. So they need to be prepared. So some of those Confederate preparations really are going to center around those guns. And the guns that they are using are incredibly important to discuss. So we are going to get a little technical here. Because the majority of the guns that are inside of Fort Pulaski are going to be what are called smoothbore artillery. The bottom picture kind of shows you these casemated guns. So these guns are underneath those arches pointing out of those windows. And you can see at the top what a smoothbore is. That top gun has absolutely no ridges, no bumps. It is smooth from the front to the back. It fires what we typically expect to see a cannon firing. It fires a round cannonball. And the guns inside of Fort Pulaski have pretty good aim. They can fire a maximum of up to 1 mile, but are accurate up to about a half a mile, which for Fort Pulaski is perfect. Because the nearest usable body of land, the nearest land that is not simply going to be marsh, where you can actually put something and fight from, is Tybee Island, exactly 1 mile away from Fort Pulaski. The very maximum distance of these smoothbore guns. But that channel, the north and south channel of the Savannah River, are only half a mile away from Fort Pulaski. And so if they're going to do a naval attack against this fort, as many people expect them to do, because you can't fire 1 mile away and do anything accurately, because your enemy is probably using the exact same guns, the exact same technology. So they're going to have to come up the river. And at a half a mile away, they can blow them quite literally out of the water. And so the Confederates inside this fort are feeling pretty confident, especially as they bring in more and more of these guns, until total by about November of 1861, they're going to be seeing around 50 cannons inside of this fort. It's nowhere near the 146 that the fort is built to use, but for the fact that this is basically a brand new country, that you're seeing men who have never really used these guns before, that are slowly beginning trained on them, that's an impressive amount of firepower. And the man who's going to be placed in charge of that firepower is a 25-year-old Savannah native named Colonel Charles H. Olmsted. And you've got a photo of Olmsted here. He's put in charge in November of 1861. He's 25 years old. I am 29, and I cannot imagine being in charge of over 200 men inside of this small fort. It's a lot of pressure on him, especially as a Savannah native, because if something happens and the worst comes to worst and this fort does fall, who is to blame? Him. So he has a lot of pressure, and so he's keeping an eye out, seeing what exactly is happening. In the first week of November of 1861, he's looking again up to South Carolina, to a place called Port Royal. And from Fort Pulaski, they are able to watch as Union ships begin to attack Port Royal. They can see the guns, they can hear the guns and the smoke going off. And eventually they're going to learn that Port Royal has fallen to the Union. And they start to get very, very worried. Because where are they probably heading to next? None other than Fort Pulaski. And so Colonel Olmsted is going to begin preparing the fort, and he's going to go up to his commanding officers. We're going to see the return of someone that we've already talked about, Confederate General Robert E. Lee. At this point, Robert E. Lee has not yet been brought north. He's not yet in Virginia. He's not yet kind of the Lee that we think about here at Gettysburg. Instead, when he is down there, he is in charge of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And he's going to arrive there at Fort Pulaski, seeing the fort that he had first begun working on and seeing it completed for the very first time. And he's going to look around. He's going to go up on the terraplane on the second portion of the fort, begin to look out towards Tybee Island. And he is going to be quoted as saying, "They will make it hot for you, but they cannot breach your walls from that distance." They're going to make this very hot. They're going to be able to fire their guns at you, but at this distance, there is no way that the Union Army will be able to breach the walls, be able to punch holes into the fort's walls. Some might say famous last words, because this is going to give Olmsted a lot of confidence. It's going to give the roughly 200 or so men inside of Fort Pulaski a lot of confidence. Their commanding officers looked at it and said, "You'll be fine." And so they're going to begin making some extra preparations. The main preparations they're going to make in anticipation of an attack is going to be what is called blindage and shot catchers, both of which can be seen in this photograph. It looks a bit like a mess, because it is. Blindage is simply bringing in large pieces of timber, large pieces of wood, laying them up against the wall to create a little bit of a pathway so you can safely walk beneath them, throwing dirt on top. And the shot catchers are very simple. It's those ditches that are being dug into the parade ground. Digging into these ditches in hopes that they're going to be able to catch any shot that might go over top of the walls and protect the inside of the fort. It's very, very simple, but things very rapidly begin to change, because the Union Army is going to arrive on Tybee Island in November of 1861. So they begin to arrive on Tybee Island. Soon the commander is going to be chosen, 36-year-old Quincy Adams Gilmore. Gilmore is going to arrive, and he immediately looks around and realizes he's got time on his hands, because he is about a mile away. If he uses the technology at the time, if he uses those smoothbore guns, it's not going to go well. If he tries to do a naval attack, it's not going to go well. The fort has the advantage. So he starts to plan, and he comes up with a two-part plan. The first part is going to be able to blockade the fort, to be able to cut it off from Savannah itself, cut it off from any supplies. The second part is going to be to actually shoot the fort itself, to bombard it. But that first part is going to be very, very difficult. Beginning in November of 1861, they're going to be going through South Carolina, going on up about 5 miles above the Fort Pulaski itself. They're going to be going in search of islands that they can use to be able to put cannons on to stop any steamships that might be coming down. And the man who's going to be put in charge of helping find those islands is going to be a familiar Gettysburg name, Patrick O'Rourke. Before he is put in charge of the 140th New York, before he is here at Gettysburg, he is going to be down in South Carolina and Georgia. One of his first things is going to be looking for these islands. He'll eventually find Bird's and Jones Islands, and he will be the one overseeing the placement of these cannons, overseeing this blockade as it begins. Of course, we know that eventually he will leave here at Gettysburg, or leave Fort Pulaski. He'll be put in charge of the colonelcy of the 140th New York on July 2nd, 1863, just a couple miles away on Little Round Top. He will die in battle here. But first, he's acting as an aide, finding these places to build these cannons, and by February of 1862, everything is prepared. They're going to successfully put this fort under a blockade. No forts or no supply ships are going to be able to arrive here at Fort Pulaski, and suddenly the men inside are very concerned because they only have about 6 months worth of supplies. And so by the end of 6 months, everyone inside that fort knows that they're going to have to either surrender the fort or risk starvation. So they have about 6 months, but the Union Army is not going to be sitting idly by. They've put in part one, but now they need to work on the second part. But Gilmore's been looking around. He realizes that his smoothbore artillery is not going to be able to breach those walls. He knows that Robert E. Lee is probably right in that regard, though he did not know that Robert E. Lee had said that. But Gilmore also knows that there's a new technology out there, rifled artillery. A brand new piece of technology, really only kind of coming about in the end of the 1850s, beginning of the 1860s, and it's never really been used. Certainly never used against masonry forts like this. And so he does not know how this will go. It is a very big risk. But he knows that in testing this rifled artillery, because of those grooves that are inside, because it changes up that projectile from a cannonball to more of a cone shape, kind of like what we expect a modern day bullet to be, it is going to increase that range from 1 mile to a maximum of 5 miles, accurate at 3 miles. Tybee Island is 1 mile away. So Gilmore decides it is worth a risk. He puts his reputation, he puts his very job on the line. And he's going to bring in a total of 36 cannons onto Tybee Island, 10 of which are going to be this brand new technology. But getting that new technology onto the island is going to be a very big job, because Tybee Island is a beach. If you go out there, you are going to find a lot of sand. You are going to find that it's not the best for carrying cannons that can weigh anywhere from 4,000 to 12,000 pounds. So the way that they're going to be able to move all of this is using this contraption pictured here, a sling cart. Basically, you have a huge cart where you sling the cannon barrel up underneath, but you can't use horses. Horses are loud. You can't move in the daytime because they can see you from Fort Pulaski. And so at nighttime, using only whistles to communicate, 250 men are going to be hooked up to an artillery piece, to one of these sling carts, and haul it across Tybee Island, disguising everything as they go, hiding them in the daytime for months. They begin this work almost as soon as the fort is blockaded, and they won't be prepared until April of 1862. By the night of April 9th, 1862, folks are looking around. The Union Army goes, "We are prepared. Now is the time for the second part of the plan, to bombard Fort Pulaski." So on the morning of April 10th of 1862, you are going to see about 8 o'clock in the morning, a couple of men going on a boat across the river on a flag of truce. They're going to hand Colonel Olmsted the demands for surrender, and Olmsted's going to take some time thinking about it. He takes 30 minutes. When he sends back his response, it is short and to the point. "I am here to defend the fort, not to surrender it." Now notice he'll get back, and the order is going to come at 8 o'clock in the morning on April 10th, 1862, to open fire on Fort Pulaski. A single mortar is going to be fired, and that mortar will soon be followed by another. Then the cannons are going to open fire, and soon the entire battle is going to begin. You're going to begin to see this fighting begin to take place, and one man is going to say that away went a shell, bursting over the fort and scattering the fragments about the rebel gunners. This was a signal given for our batteries to open. The fort replied actively, and the noise of about 50 pieces made the ground fairly rock. For a long time, the rebels devoted all their energy to the battery which opened, and the shells flew about our ears like a swarm of bees. For nearly 10 hours, these guns are going to be firing away at each other. All 36 of Tybee Island's guns are aimed at Fort Pulaski. But only about 20 of the roughly 50 guns inside of the fort can be aimed at Tybee Island. Because you see, for Fort Pulaski, they're not just focusing on Tybee Island. They don't have just one target. They're trying to control the entire river, and so a lot of their guns have been placed throughout the fort, meaning only 20 of them could be brought to bear on where the shooting is actually taking place. And for the next 10 hours, you are going to begin to see these guns begin to go off. For nearly 10 hours until finally night began to fall. And when night fell, the guns slowly go silent. No one likes a night attack if they can help it. But by 11 o'clock, that silence slowly goes away. The Union Army begins firing yet again, firing about only once, twice, maybe 3 times an hour. Not enough to really do damage. You can't see much at this point, but it's enough to keep the men inside awake and worried about what might be happening. Just enough to keep them concerned. And there is a lot of concern already going on, because in that brief lull, men like Olmsted and other soldiers have been able to walk around the fort and see some of the damage that's been going on. They've had 20 guns firing, and some of them have already been dismounted. Direct hits from the Union artillery. And so suddenly some of these guns are not able to be used because these guns weigh thousands of pounds. You're not getting that back up where it needs to be, not without taking the time and potentially risking being shot. So suddenly they find that they are running out. They're also going to find that much of that blindage has begun to be struck, has begun to be hit. But more concerning than that is the inside of the fort. Bricks have begun to splinter, bricks falling into the moat that went around the fort, slowly coming in some cases burying cannons underneath of them. And a lot of the folks who are inside the fort, who aren't walking around, suddenly start to see corners like this and go, this is what the inside looks like. What is happening on the outside? For Colonel Olmsted, he takes the risk, even as those guns begin to go off in that evening, to go around the outside to take stock of the damage. And what he sees is nothing short of shocking. He sees a breach. A hole has begun to form in the southeast corner of the fort. By the end of the battle, it'll be large enough for 5 to 6 men to stand side by side with room to spare. That moat around the fort was typically about 8 feet deep, but by the end of the battle, it's going to only be a couple feet deep because of the sheer amount of bricks that have fallen into it. You're suddenly going to begin to see a lot of damage they don't think should be happening. They can make it hot for you, Robert E. Lee said, but they cannot breach your walls from this distance. But suddenly that's exactly what is happening. For the Union Army, as daylight begins to break on April 11th, 1862, they begin to look across and they can see the damage they have done. They can see the breaches that they've made, and they've realized that those 10 rifle cannons that they had aimed at one specific corner have done their job. Not only have they done their job, they have done it very, very well. To the point that by the early afternoon, they've begun to widen those holes, widen those breaches out, until they can begin to fire directly through them. As they begin to go through, they start to hit that blindage. That blindage begins to be destroyed. And soon, the Union Army is firing directly through the holes in that fort, directly across the northern portion of the fort, where the powder magazine is. And that fort had 40,000 pounds of black powder in this one magazine. It's around that point, in the early afternoon of April 11th, 1862, that the Confederate Army inside of Fort Pulaski begins to realize that something big has happened, something drastic has changed. And as they begin to watch that powder magazine be struck, Olmsted realizes what he is going to have to do. The breach in our wall, he is going to say afterwards, gave free access to the projectiles that had made it directly to our north magazine. The brickwork covering the magazine door was struck 5 or 6 times in secession, and it was evident that it was only a question of 2 or 3 hours whether the lives of the whole garrison should be discharged by the explosion of the magazine, for the result was inevitable. Under these circumstances, cut off from all hope of relief or the possibility of retreat, the fort practically breached, some of my most effective guns rendered useless, and the magazine liable to be blown up in a very short time, I felt compelled to yield. And that's exactly what he's going to do. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 11th, 1862, the white flag of surrender is going to go up. In a short little bit of time, Quincy Adams Gilmore is going to arrive under a flag of truce, and he and Olmsted are going to disappear into Olmsted's quarters for about an hour. They're going to be discussing the terms of surrender. And as they're discussing those terms of surrender, there's only one term that can be accepted: unconditional surrender. After 30 hours of bombardment, Fort Pulaski is officially surrendered. Its entire garrison will be taken as prisoners of war. They'll eventually be sent away to go as POWs before eventually being kind of exchanged and sent out, many of them returning to the war, including Olmsted himself. But three major things changed because of this fight. Three undeniable things. The first, of course, is that the Port of Savannah is going to be shut down for the duration of the Civil War. The Union Army is going to go in and they're going to claim Fort Pulaski, and no ships are going to get in or out of the Savannah River until the close of the war in 1865. But more importantly than that, you're going to be seeing that rifle technology, those rifled guns being used for the very first time and proven to work, especially against fortifications. And by a few years later, you're going to see smoothbore artillery becoming a thing of the past. Rifle technology will soon be taking over. But the final thing that this battle is going to prove is going to go to that fort itself. That fort that took 18 years to build is rendered obsolete in 30 hours. 30 hours to make an 18-year project completely pointless. After this point, you will never see a masonry fort being built again. To this day, you won't see any of these forts except if you go to a park like Fort Pulaski. But even though everyone knows that this fort cannot withstand attack, that if the Confederates come back and get Tybee Island, it is all over, the exact same thing can happen, the Union Army still needs to use the fort. They still need to blockade that river, and so you're going to be seeing Fort Pulaski remaining in Union hands for the duration of the war. You're going to be seeing things changing. You're going to see men garrisoning it. You can see an entire regiment right there. How large that fort can hold all those men. But you're also going to be seeing Fort Pulaski, Cockspur Island, even Tybee Island becoming a stop on the Underground Railroad. A place for many of these enslaved people in Savannah to escape to take their freedom. Some will arrive on Fort Pulaski and they're going to stay there. They'll stay in that old construction village that you can see right down there at the bottom. Others will begin to go elsewhere, begin to go to other islands in order to kind of continue on, maybe find family, to seek freedom elsewhere. And the Union Army, for the whole time they're in Fort Pulaski, are always going to be worried about a Confederate attack, that the Confederacy is going to try and return. But the Confederates never will. They've got other things on their mind, and Fort Pulaski is pretty firmly in the Union hands. The only way that the Confederacy will return is in 1864, as prisoners of war. The specific men who are going to be brought to Fort Pulaski get a nickname called the Immortal 600. Now, the Immortal 600 story does not begin in Fort Pulaski. It begins in Charleston, South Carolina. Specifically, it's going to begin when a bunch of a Confederate officer inside of Charleston begins to bring in Union prisoners. They're going to be held underneath Union fire from Morris Island. That news is going to get out, and the Union Army looks around and goes, well, that's not very fair. We can bring in some men of yours. Hold them under your fire. They bring in more men and more until soon both sides have 600 men, Union and Confederate officers, held underneath fire of their own men. And very quickly, everyone realizes this is getting out of hand. This is a bad situation. And eventually, a yellow fever epidemic in Charleston is going to allow the Confederates to kind of save a little bit of face and remove those men out of Charleston. But now the Union Army is looking around going, okay, we have 600 Confederate officers. Where do we send them? We don't want to send them back up north to all these prisoner of war camps because the exchange is broken down at this point. So we need to store them somewhere. And oh, look, Fort Pulaski is nearby and it's not doing anything. And so 540 of those men are going to be sent down to Fort Pulaski. They'll be arriving on October 23rd of 1864. When they arrive, they're going to find this waiting for them. Simple little wooden bunks and iron bars. They're also going to be seeing at the top photo cannons directed towards them, for in case they try and escape. These men are going to be representing the entire Confederate Army. They're going to be soldiers coming from all of the Confederate states, including Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, 3 of these border states. While they're there, they are going to be having some soldiers who have been captured here at the Battle of Gettysburg. A large number of that 540 are going to be coming from Gettysburg. And of those original 600 men, 44 are going to die in captivity. Of that 44, 13 of them die at Fort Pulaski. And of that 13, 3 of them are Confederate prisoners captured here at the Battle of Gettysburg. The first man was to die at Fort Pulaski from the Immortal 600 is going to be a member of the 49th Georgia, Second Lieutenant Iverson L. Birney, who at 23 years old was captured very close to where we now stand on July 2nd, 1863. He'll die on November 12th, 1864, of chronic diarrhea. He'll be followed a few months later on January 28th of 1865 by First Lieutenant John M. Bergen of the 22nd North Carolina, age 22, captured again, very close to where we now stand, on July 3rd, excuse me. And the final man who's going to die will die on March 4th of 1865, Captain Osney R. Brumley of the 20th North Carolina, age 26, captured on July 1st, dying of double pneumonia. 3 of that 13 captured right on this field where we now stand. Now, of course, there will be other Confederate officers who will be captured here at Gettysburg who will find themselves at Fort Pulaski and who will be able to make their way out, who will return to the war or to other prisoner of war camps, and many of them will survive. 44, that's 600 will not. But of course, if you are going to have these prisoners, you need guards over them, and that brings us to another Gettysburg connection. Because after the Battle of Gettysburg, you're going to be seeing a lot of these corps being kind of broken up. You're going to be seeing a lot of these men being sent elsewhere, and one of the groups being sent elsewhere is 157th New York, who fight out on the July 1st battlefield along modern-day Howard Avenue. They're going to take massive casualties here on July 1st of 1863. Around 307 of 431 are going to be lost on this battlefield for the 157th New York. They take these massive casualties, and then shortly after they're going to be sent south, down to South Carolina, and eventually finding themselves in October 1864 at Fort Pulaski. The man in charge is the man that you can see right up there, Colonel Philip Brown. And Philip Brown gets the dubious honor of being put in charge of not just a fort, but a prisoner of war camp, something he was not really expecting to do, and he doesn't really have a lot of experience doing. But he finds himself in charge, and he kind of starts to look around and goes, well, I'm going to treat them as if I had been captured, how I would want myself to be treated. And he treats them very humanely, which in many ways goes against the direct orders that he has received. But he's going to do a little bit of a lie. He's going to say that he never receives the orders that say to put that Immortal 600 onto a starvation diet. He's simply going to continue to allow them to visit settlers, to give them a full ration, until an under-the-table exchange occurs, because those still happen. If you have enough weight and money during the Civil War, almost anything is possible. And so you're going to see a couple of men being exchanged, and as they are kind of grateful for the treatment that they received, they write to the Charleston newspaper saying how grateful they are to Philip Brown, the 157th New York, for the humanity that they are shown. And of course, the Union Army is very quickly going to get a hold of that newspaper, see this, and Philip Brown's going to be reprimanded. General Foster in December of 1864 is going to write to Philip Brown saying that praise from the enemy is the last thing that an officer should seek or permit to be bestowed upon him. These officers were sent to this department for the purpose of retaliation, and your instructions were to treat them in precisely the same manner that our prisoners of war in the hands of our enemy have been treated. General Foster is going to send 3 copies of the order to put these men on a starvation diet, making sure that Philip Brown sees it. With all eyes now turned on him, Philip Brown realizes that he has no choice, that he needs to kind of correspond to what he's been told, and he'll place these men on starvation diets. And that's when you'll see a lot of these men begin to die of starvation and causes thereof. But Philip Brown doesn't stop fighting, because Philip Brown very much believes in humanity and treating people like human beings. And he hates that order that he's been given, so he starts trying to bring in all of the medical people that he can, even going so far as to bring people out of the army. And eventually he's going to get one of these surgeons in who's going to look at these men and go, you need to give them full rations right this second. Put them back on these rations, and that finally is able to spur him to be able to get permission to put them back on full rations, saving perhaps a lot of these lives. But it also costs him his position there at Fort Pulaski, which he's probably a little grateful for. 157th New York will be sent away in February of 1865, and in March of 1865, the remaining of those Immortal 600 will be sent back to places like Fort Delaware, where they'll spend out the rest of the Civil War, for just those last few little months. In Fort Pulaski, as the war comes to an end, we'll still not see everything being done. So the war comes to an end, they are still going to continue to use the fort at least up until the 1870s, 1880s, but at that point it's going to be completely abandoned. Once again, there'll only be a few caretakers, this time in the form of lighthouse keepers who are going to stay there until about 1910. You can see the Coxbottom Lighthouse down there at the bottom. It's a little tiny thing, only about 32 feet high. In fact, those lighthouse keepers are going to have pretty much free reign of that fort. They're even going to live inside of the fort at one point after a huge hurricane comes through in the 1880s, destroying that old construction village. They're going to build a 2-story house on top of the fort. But by 1910, there's no need for that lighthouse. Ships are only going on the North Channel. There's no reason to continue up there. And so they're going to begin to tear everything down, and the fort's abandoned until 1924. In 1924, the federal government's going to look around. They're going to declare Fort Pulaski a national monument. But that doesn't change much. Because at that point, they're not really going to try and fix anything up. They'll see a little bit more use throughout the Spanish-American War, but really it's going to be the World Wars that are going to really spurn more interest in Fort Pulaski, and specifically in the restoration of Fort Pulaski and opening it up to visitors as a national park. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps is going to make their way to Fort Pulaski, and for the next 10 years, they're going to be put to work restoring it to the 1862 appearance, which is a lot of work. That moat has to be redug, and in some cases, as this photograph shows, accidents happen. They put this digger a little too close to the moat walls, and over it topped. I like to think that the man who caused this accident is the one sitting right in the center, kind of cheekily grinning up at the camera. He knows he's just created a lot of jobs for these men. They'll be there for about 10 years, until about 1942, when the fort will finally be kind of fully restored. They've got a temporary visitor center, only to immediately close because World War II was broken out. And for a long time, we had no idea what they were doing on that island. We simply knew that in 1942, the island had been closed, and a single man was left behind to represent the Park Service. Just recently, in the past few years, those records have been unclassified, and so today we know that they were actually out there using this fort to watch for U-boats in the Savannah River. And so we know that today, and apparently it was not that exciting, because by 1947, the war is over, and this fort is officially going to be opened up as Fort Pulaski National Monument. Ever since then, it has remained open, and visitors from all across the country are going to be flocking to what's called Savannah's National Park. They'll be coming there every year, except for a few years when it got hit by hurricanes and had to close, except for a few years when COVID shut it down, and for a few months. But if you go down to Savannah, Georgia today, you can still go out, you can still explore the exact same positions that these men saw. You can still explore those Gettysburg connections if you go out there. And this is a very small little fort located down in Savannah, Georgia. A lot of people didn't even realize it had Gettysburg connections. But I hope that by tonight, by coming out here on what is now finally cooled off just enough, I hope you guys have learned a little bit. I hope you've enjoyed learning about something that's not necessarily Gettysburg related. And if you have any final questions, I'm happy to answer them. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for spending a little portion of your night with me, and enjoy the rest of your visit here in Gettysburg.